Welcome back to DemocraZy!
I'm your co-host, Charvi.
And I'm your co-host, Emma.
DemocraZy is a podcast brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Virginia, Youth Council.
And we are back for our episode 5 after a short hiatus.
Because school is tough.
Well, I graduated high school, so.
This is My Body, Whose Choice? That's okay.
Thank you so much to my friend Peter for making us that little jingle, and to my friend Maddie for making our logo, as well as to Nikki, our fantastic behind-the-scenes logistical help, and Joan Port, the president of the Virginia League of Women Voters.
Also, shout out to Maisha, Uma, Bobby, and Sadie, who work with Nikki for all of our social media. They're the best. Okay. Got my driver's license last week.
You did? Finally.
Just like we always talked about.
I was so excited for you.
Yes, you were so excited for me to finally drive up to your house.
I was.
But today I drove through the suburbs.
That's where I live.
Lost the freaking ticket war.
And you broke your computer in my driveway.
Yeah, that too. So I broke my computer in her driveway today, but literally, what was it? I don't even remember when the ticket war was, but literally between my AP Gov exam and Emma's art class.
No, I was trying to win the ticket war on her computer with her Amex card in class while she was taking the Gov exam.
She was late to art because of that. It was terrible.
But it was okay. I was about to graduate. It doesn't matter.
No, but someone tell me why
why.
Ain't nothing. Stop.
Okay.
Stop. Not okay. Someone tell me. And for what reason I lost the ticket war for 2 separate dates on 2 separate tries, and every single time I was the last in queue on Ticketmaster. Hello, does Ticketmaster hate me? I promise they didn't refresh my page either, because everyone is if you refresh your page, you're going to be last in queue.
Sorry.
Point is, we lost the Olivia ticket war, and I'm really sad because I'm not going to get to experience an Olivia Rodrigo concert this year.
But we kind of get to experience something else about her through this episode in a way, if you really think about it. Olivia Rodrigo has this really cool charity organization called The Fun for Good.
She does a lot of really cool stuff. She's always on stage saying a little something.
Yeah, and so The Fun for Good is essentially a organization where she donates a percentage of ticket sales and merch sales to women's nonprofits. In Europe, it was for violence against women. For Canada,
oh, really?
It was domestic or women's shelters, and then in the United States, it was the National Network for Abortion Funds.
Which is actually really timely because, as we know, Roe v. Wade was overturned only 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's crazy. That was back in COVID already. Because 2022 is when COVID was rounding off, right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. What an
era. I was on the beach when it was overturned, and we were social distancing from the other people on the beach, and we were reading the news, and we were no.
Oh.
It was crazy.
That's an insane image to get in my head, bro.
I know.
But yeah, the point is, reproductive freedom is definitely a massive fight these days on the internet. We've seen it throughout the 2000s, to be honest, but it's definitely amplified after Roe v. Wade was overturned. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what our episode is about today, and we do want to recognize we're talking about reproductive freedom as a civic issue, as it's going to appear in campaigns or on your ballot. But there is a lot of history when it comes to abortion and birth control that's honestly pretty terrible. It's unsavory. It's related to how enslaved peoples were treated in this country and how indigenous peoples were forcibly sterilized. So we are dedicating a separate video to that, and we really want you guys to look out for it because while it doesn't exactly relate to the fight as it's embodied today, it's really essential context for, I think, any voter to understand when they're discussing these issues with sensitivity.
Yeah, so we'll have a separate TikTok dropping alongside this podcast episode for that. With that, we're going to move on to our Civic Case, which I very aptly named My Body, Whose Choice.
Definitely not the name for anything
else.
But
we're more fun than research papers, so who cares?
Exactly. I'm going to take you guys through a little bit of the history. We're going to start at the 1910s. So 1910s, the United States effectively has a nationwide ban on abortion, not because Uncle Sam was like, oh, no abortion for anyone, but more because every single state essentially had enacted a ban on abortion by that time. It was a huge stigma, huge taboo. Nobody wants to talk about reproductive rights or birth control. It's not okay to talk about these things. Don't even bring it up. And that's the climate in which Margaret Sanger comes up. She starts to pick up some steam. If you know Margaret Sanger, you probably heard her name in A-Push during the unit about...
the progressive era.
Yeah, Unit 7. Don't even. I'm getting flashbacks.
Unit 7?
It is Unit 7, and Unit 7 is like the fattest unit of A-Push.
Oh, it's like World War I and World War II.
And it's like all of the progressive era. So that's a,
anyway,
that's a
I
juicy,
digress.
I know, right? I digress. But point is, Margaret Sanger was a huge figure during the progressive era. She was a massive advocate for birth control. And fun fact about her, her niece was married to the guy that made up Wonder Woman.
And we love Wonder Woman here, but not the movie.
Moving on. So Margaret Sanger, huge advocate for birth control. I do want to note that she was a proponent of eugenics. And if you don't know what eugenics are, it was this ideology of better breeding, which essentially means birth control can be used to eliminate any children with disabilities, mental health issues, children of color, etc. So that's kind of that dark history that we were alluding to that we are going to dedicate a separate video to. But that is where this movement begins, and it really has evolved since then. Now, despite Margaret Sanger's efforts during the progressive era, birth control and abortion remain to be taboo. And it's really unfortunate. Throughout the 20th century, you're seeing so many millions of women die annually because they're committing or they're administering unsafe abortions to themselves. They're doing things like you've seen in the movies, such as sticking tree bark or coat hangers up their uterus just to abort, because they literally have no other way to, in some instances, save themselves or to actually viably have a child. And that obviously led to a lot more death. And eventually you get to a climate where people will notice that this is a problem, but not until it's already accelerated by the time of the Great Depression, when it was economically unviable to have children.
Exactly.
By 1960s, the government starts to notice there's a problem, so the FDA approves the first commercially available birth control pill called, I believe, Enovid or something. I might be wrong on that pronunciation. Look it up.
Enovid.
But the social climate is also shifting, and something really cool I want to talk about is called the Jane Collective. We're gonna go to Chicago, roughly 1960, late 1960, and we're gonna start with a woman named Heather Booth. Heather Booth was a student at the University of Chicago, and she had this friend who had become pregnant and needed to get an abortion. So this friend calls Booth, and she's like, do you know anyone that can help me out? And Booth refers her to a doctor that she knew. Pretty soon, lots of women come to know that Booth has this doctor handy, and they ask Booth to refer them as well. And there's so many women that Booth starts to recruit other badass housewives and students that live in Chicago. She starts to recruit them, and she's like, hey, I need some help to be this counseling service. And this group of women that, works to refer other women who need abortions to doctors who can give them those abortions, they become known as the service, which is kind of
very
an ominous, exactly, very ominous name, but it's really cool. Eventually, a lot of these women start to pick up the skills that you need in order to actually administer the abortion yourself. By the 1970s, the Jane Collective, so women would be like, are you pregnant? Call Jane. That was actually a literal poster on some of these really old newspapers that were circulating underground. Unfortunately, by 1972, what happens is that the Jane Collective and their underground networks are raided by the police. And a lot of the women who are actually able of administering abortions were taken custody. So the Jane Collective comes to an end. But only a year later, most of these women's charges are dropped. What else happened in 1973?
So in 1973, the Supreme Court heard the case Roe v. Wade. And let's just do a little story time of the woman who sparked it going back to the 70s. There was a woman named Norma McCorvey, aka Jane Roe.
Jane.
Not on purpose, but very symbolic. Norma, or Jane, got pregnant with a third kid and didn't want to have the kid, so said, I'm going to try to get an abortion. But she lived in Texas, and in Texas, abortions were only legal if the mother's life was at risk, which hers was not. So she sues the district attorney, whose name is Henry Wade, Roe v. Wade, and the case makes its way up to the Supreme Court after she appeals it from the lower court, whose ruling she doesn't think was fair. So the Supreme Court ultimately rules that abortion is a fundamental right, and the reasoning behind that is something we'll get to later. But something else it said is and that there was a trimester-based framework for when states were allowed to restrict people from getting abortions.
The really weird thing about this trimester-based framework is that there was no medical input when it was made at all. It was really just arbitrarily conjured up by the 9 justices at that time, which can raise some questions. You know, we look at Roe v. Wade as this big landmark case that was revolutionary, but there were still some problems with the ultimate ruling that came out of it.
Exactly. And so with that being said, we're going to kind of go through the trimesters. So from month 0 to month 3 of your pregnancy, there was absolutely no permissible restriction from states.
Wow.
You know, states could not say you can't get an abortion because you want an abortion. You could just get an abortion. The second trimester, months 3 to 6, states could regulate abortion, but not if the mother had a health reason. So if the mom said, I want an abortion because I don't want a kid, the state could say, you're not allowed to have that abortion. But if the mom said, I'm getting an abortion because I'm chronically ill and I don't think I can have a kid and stay healthy, then the state cannot restrict that because the mother has a health reason. From months 6 through 9, it's kind of like months 3 through 6, but it's a lot more restricted. And women can only get completely unrestricted abortions if their life is at risk, so if they would otherwise die. Along with all of this, the court still said that having unwanted children might, quote, force upon the woman a distressful life and future, or bring imminent psychological harm, or because there may be, quote, distress for all concerned associated with the unwanted child.
That's pretty progressive for the time.
Even though there's this trimester framework, there is still a clear recognition that having unwanted children is harmful to the mother. But post-1973, there was no more difference in state laws on a very, very harsh scale. So, you know, there wasn't a situation where in the first 3 months, a woman in Texas wouldn't be able to get the healthcare she needed versus a woman in California could do whatever she wanted. It was just the trimester framework across the entire nation.
Got you. So when you say that abortion was fundamentally considered a right, where exactly did they get that? Because obviously the Constitution doesn't say...
The Constitution does not say, Congress shall make no law restricting the right to get an abortion. But we do have the 9th Amendment, which says that people have rights that aren't explicitly listed in the Constitution.
It's like implied rights.
Exactly, implied rights. And the 14th Amendment says that a state cannot deprive people of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And so what the right to abortion was before Roe was overturned was a substantive due process right that is implied and that you get out of the 9th Amendment's implied rights rather than it just being explicitly listed.
So it's like you go to court to protect your implied rights.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so it's basically saying that where the 14th Amendment says life, liberty, and property, abortion rights are an example of that liberty.
Got you.
Which is kind of complicated with the wording, but really all you need to know is that even though abortion isn't explicitly listed, Roe v. Wade determined that it was a constitutional right.
That's so interesting. And it really was radical for that time, I guess, because you do get a lot of legal backlash. You have the Hyde Amendment just 3 years later, which said that abortion wouldn't be covered by Medicare unless the pregnancy was because of incest, sexual assault, or the woman's life was in danger. So basically, I don't think Congress was a big fan of what happened in Roe v. Wade. Some of the people socially were, though. You see the rise of groups like Sister Song in the 1990s, which was led by Black women, and that's actually kind of rectifying that bad history that we were talking about with eugenics. It's all these women coming together and making the fight for reproductive freedom a lot more intersectional, inclusive, of women of different abilities and socioeconomic backgrounds and of different races. So that's really interesting to see kind of how the reaction divulged. It was like more conservative legally, but more progressive socially.
Unfortunately, though, the post-Roe landscape didn't last forever. As we talked about earlier, Roe was overturned in 2022 by the case Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization.
Yeah.
So what happened is in 2018, there was a Mississippi law that banned abortion after 15 weeks. And the Dobbs case challenged its constitutionality. So it was the Jackson Women's Health Organization saying this law is unconstitutional and unfair and it should be overturned. So after that case made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, the court held that abortion is neither a constitutional right, like Roe v. Wade said, nor a fundamental right. And by fundamental right, it essentially means that nothing about rule of law, common law origins from Great Britain centuries ago, our general legal landscape say that it is a natural right that humans should have.
They actually said that the ruling in Roe was egregiously wrong in Dobbs, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, so even though the background is really complicated and I don't really want to get into the common law weeds of it all, what you really need to know is that Dobbs essentially overturned Roe and it returned the right to restrict or regulate abortion access to the states. So now, if Texas wanted to, it could restrict abortion in the first trimester, even though Roe's trimester framework would have prohibited that post-1973.
So when Roe was, ruled on, I would assume that a lot of states still had laws that were against abortion in the first trimester or second trimester or third trimester.
Exactly. So there were laws from before 1973 that had restricted abortion that had been essentially rendered moot after Roe v. Wade.
So they were null.
They were null. But when Roe was overturned, those laws kind of regained their power. So you have a lot of states with laws from before 1973 that came back and returned those state statutes all the way back to decades ago.
So we literally went back 100 years to 1910.
Well, 1973, but basically, yes.
Yeah.
But something else we need to talk about is that there were a lot of trigger laws. So, first of all, people had suspected for a decade that the court would revisit abortion rights sometime in the future since the court had become more conservative in the time between Roe and Dobbs. And so what happened is in the decade before the Dobbs decision, you see that a lot of states are passing laws that don't actually do anything, but they take effect once Roe is overturned. So, for example, a state would pass a law saying no abortion after 15 weeks, and that wouldn't be applicable under Roe. But as soon as Roe's gone, there's nothing stopping them.
Wow.
And so a state...
They're anticipating.
Exactly. A state could pass a law in 2010 saying that would take effect in 2022. And so that's the real issue.
That's kind of insane. I know that, it's scary. We've seen this a lot on social media. But there are also a lot of states that are doing the opposite, and they're trying actively to enshrine reproductive rights in their own constitutions, which is actually something that Virginia is doing. This November, reproductive freedom is going to be something that you can vote on as an amendment to our Constitution. So we're going to actually talk to Tom Jones, the campaign manager for Virginians for Reproductive Freedom, about this amendment, some of its language, some of the issues that are going on right now, and how you can support it. Let's take it away. Hi, Han. How are you doing today?
Doing well. How about yourselves?
We're doing good.
Great.
We're so excited to be here.
Yeah, so our first question is kind of about the general shift in reproductive activism over the last decade. Can you kind of identify the shift, especially in the wake of the Dobbs decision, and how you as an activist organization have been affected by it?
Yeah, I mean, the Dobbs decision was absolutely devastating for so many Virginians, so many Americans. Almost overnight, millions of people lost a right that many of us thought we would have for our entire lives, that many of our mothers and grandmothers fought for. And I think it did shift the way that we approach our reproductive activism a lot because our resolve has never had to be stronger. Uh, we in Virginia are the last state in the South without an extreme post-Roe abortion ban. And we're watching the consequences of these abortion bans right next door. We've seen people die because they were unable to access abortion care. We've seen people lose their fertility and go through serious medical complications because they aren't able to access necessary miscarriage management care. We've seen attacks on fertility treatment in the South as well. Um, forcing some people to not be able to access in vitro fertilization and grow their families the way that they would like to. So we're seeing the consequences of these extreme abortion bans, and our resolve has never had to be stronger because we know we can't allow that to come to Virginia. We see the consequences. So we see more activism and we see more action and we see people coming out to tell their stories and to really humanize these really important issues. Uh, we've seen deaths and sepsis and criminalization of providers. And all of this has meant that these bans and restrictions that are threatening the health of people across the country uh, have made us see in Virginia why what we have is so critical and why we need to fight so hard to ensure that Virginia doesn't become the next state in the South with an extreme abortion ban.
That I do think a lot of people kind of hesitate to enter those conversations because they're concerned that people might be belligerent or adversarial or not listen to their point of view.
Right. One of those groups is sometimes men, and people are like, men don't really have a space here. They shouldn't share their opinions. I think Emma and I both feel that that's sometimes valid because we've seen in the past, men can dominate women's spaces, and that's really harmful. But I also, at least personally, believe that it's not productive if we're only involving women on one side and then we can't find a way to also bring in other kinds of people into this movement. What are your suggestions, or maybe how can men be productively involved in the reproductive freedom fight?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because, of course, like I said, we want to be able to center people who have personal experiences and stories, and so much of the time that is women. Having said that, I think everyone has a place in this movement. This movement is for everyone because reproductive freedom doesn't just touch women's lives, it touches everyone's lives. We know we all do better when we can make decisions for ourselves and our families. And that's not just for women. We celebrate everyone who wants to champion this amendment, who wants people to be able to have that autonomy, and people who just believe that politicians don't belong in our healthcare decisions. I think that keeping politicians out of our personal healthcare decisions is a non-gendered issue. We all can agree that we don't want politicians making those decisions for us. And we know that men have had personal experiences with this too. It's touched their lives through their wives, through their daughters, through their mothers. So this is an issue that continues to affect everyone. And we want to welcome everyone into this movement. And we know that it's not just women who support reproductive freedom. We know that this is an incredibly popular issue. And we know that actually many, many men are very supportive of this issue. And we think we need to make sure that we are reaching out to all of our supporters because they all have a part to play.
Yeah, you mentioned the amendment that is being voted on this fall. What can you tell us about that amendment that Virginians can vote on this November? And why is the specific language of the amendment so important?
Yeah. So the amendment that we are going to be voting on this November, I'm very excited about it, is about making the decisions about our reproductive health care for ourselves and our healthcare providers being able to act in the best interests of their patients without government interference or fear of persecution. So the ballot measure protects our freedom in Virginia to make a broad range of reproductive healthcare decisions, including prenatal care, childbirth, postpartum care, birth control, abortion, miscarriage management, and fertility care. Having all of that be part of this amendment is so important. We know that there have been attacks on some of these pieces that aren't just abortion, right? We know that birth control, we did not have an affirmative right to contraception in Virginia until this year. And previously, the protections around birth control were coming from a Supreme Court decision, which we know how quickly that can change, especially with this Supreme Court. Griswold v. Connecticut, which guaranteed the right to birth control, um, was actually named in the Dobbs case as another case that could be reconsidered. So we know that these things are under attack. We've seen the attacks on fertility treatment in neighboring states where abortion bans have been passed. So all of this care is incredibly important, and it's really important that we spell out all of this care. In addition, it's really important that we specifically name that we're ensuring that doctors and nurses can act in the best interest of their patients and not be worried about criminal punishment. In some states where there's these bans, doctors have been forced to wait to provide care because of the legislation that they're facing. And because of that, they're not able to provide the best care to their patients. We want to ensure that our healthcare providers know that they can do what is right for their patient and that no one will be punishing them for it afterwards. And our the Reproductive Freedom Amendment does allow restrictions on abortion during the third trimester. A lot of people like to say the misinformation around when people would be able to access an abortion until. I want to be clear, it does allow restrictions on abortion during the trimester, except when the patient's health is at risk or the pregnancy cannot survive. And these are really extreme cases that nobody wants to be facing.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember earlier this year, I was going through my email and I got a notification from Virginia Mercury, which, if for our viewers, if you don't know what Virginia Mercury is, they're this really cool paper and they mostly cover policy rather than just general politics. So I remember getting a notification and I saw that there had been some lawsuits filed against the amendment. So we're going to talk about a little bit some of those lawsuits. There's two. The first one was filed by a group called Liberty Counsel. And the issue that they've taken up with the amendment is that the actual passage broke some procedural rules when it was going through the General Assembly, which is an argument that was made against the very recent referendum that was passed in April. And that did bring the referendum down. So Ella and I were wondering, is there a similar issue that could actually arise with the Reproductive Freedom Amendment in the case that this lawsuit goes through?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing I want to say is that yes, we are facing a lawsuit against Liberty Counsel is bringing a suit against the Reproductive Freedom Amendment. Um, this is very different than what happened in the redistricting case, and I just want to be 100% clear in spelling out why. So, the biggest difference is that the ruling in the redistricting case was not actually around this clerk notification challenge that the Liberty Counsel is bringing, which, to be clear, has already been retroactively repealed. So, that law has not actually been in effect in Virginia for decades at this juncture. What the redistricting case ruled, what was ruled by the Supreme Court of Virginia in the redistricting case, rather, was that an intervening election is a requirement for the passage of an amendment. They ruled that the intervening election requirement was not met in the redistricting case because the first passage of redistricting happened in October after early voting had already begun. That is not the case for us. Our first passage was completed in February of 2025, a full 7 months before the start of early voting. So, as far as what they ruled on in that specific case, we do not have that same concern. Our timeline was different, and we are very confident that we will be able to defeat this lawsuit. Liberty Counsel, this is a frivolous lawsuit, and it's a desperate attempt by them to silence the will of Virginia voters. The effort to enshrine this Reproductive Freedom Amendment began more than 3 years ago. It is not the same timeline. Um, and we know that they know that when Virginians get the opportunity to vote on this amendment, that they will make their voices heard, that they will say loud and clear that this amendment is going to be part of our Constitution. So, extreme actors such as Liberty Counsel are doing everything they can to stop it from going to those voters.
We've talked a lot about the lead up to November and the election itself, but assuming the amendment passes in November, what would next steps for your organization look like that would meaningfully change the reproductive health care landscape in Virginia, even with this amendment being passed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, Virginians for Reproductive Freedom is a broad coalition that has come together with the purpose of passing this amendment. But all of our partners are already thinking about what's next for them. So, that includes our partners like Planned Parenthood Advocates of Virginia, ACLU of Virginia, ReproRising Virginia, Birth and Color RVA. I know some of the big goals that folks have include making healthcare more accessible. One of our partners, Birth and Color, cares deeply and works very, very hard on neutralizing the Black maternal mortality gap, which is the fact that at this point,
Yeah.
Black women are still significantly more likely to die as a result of pregnancy outcomes. Uh, that is something that we need to do. We need to do something about. We need to be working on, and that's a really important equity issue. So I think that's something that could get more attention, and then there's just the continuing fight against stigma, against misinformation. We know that our opposition, when we pass this amendment, it's going to really defang them in many ways. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to continue to spread lies, not just in Virginia, but across the country. So, continuing to make sure that people's stories are being heard, that we're continuing to fight for this, that we're not taking anything for granted and we're never being quiet, that we're ready for this next phase where our rights are protected. So, what comes next after that? I think in Virginia, we've been so busy over the course of the last many years fighting off against an abortion ban. We've had many introduced, some really extreme, and we've had to really work hard to ensure that we're just able to keep the status quo. So once this amendment is passed, and we know that an abortion ban is not going to come to Virginia, I think it really opens a lot of doors for all of our partners.
Absolutely. If there's anything else that you would like to add, feel free to just take the moment to put anything you want out there.
Yeah, we're just so excited to have this amendment on the ballot. This has been in progress for years. All of our partners have been working incredibly hard, and it took a lot of hard work to get to a point where is on the ballot for Virginians to directly vote on and take this out of the hands of politicians, have this stop being a political football. And we really hope that as many Virginians as possible will join us in this really important moment, join our campaign, share their story, volunteer with us, donate to us, and become a part of this really historic moment.
All right. Thank you
All right,
so
thank you.
much. We really appreciated having you on here, and back to our main segment.
Thank you so much to Han for having that great discussion with us. I think we both learned a lot. And with that being said, we're going to go into our community spotlight.
Virginians for Reproductive Freedom.
What a surprise.
I know, right? Couldn't see that one coming. But we really hope that you enjoyed the talk with Han Jones and that you go and explore their Instagram, their website, their newsletter, and really start to take this into your own hands. I really do hope that this interview and our podcast episode could answer some of your questions. And if you have more, you can always DM us at DemocraZy Pod on Instagram. You can also find us on Spotify and then YouTube under the League of Women Voters of Virginia. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.